The views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views or positions of any entities they represent. This non-commercial program is for educational purposes only.
You're listening to
आप सुन रहे हैं तुम सुनो था ನೀವು ಕೇಳ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದೀರಾ
Radio Azim Premji University.
ಓಡಗನ ಕೋಳಿ ನುಂಗಿತ್ತ ನೋಡವ್ವ ತಂಗಿ ಓಡಗನ ಕೋಳಿ ನುಂಗಿತ್ತ ಓಡಗನ ಕೋಳಿ ನುಂಗಿತ್ತ
ಕುಂಬಾರಕಿ ಈಕಿ ಕುಂಬಾರಕಿ ಈ ಬ್ರಹ್ಮಾಂಡವೆಲ್ಲ
ಗುಡಿಯ ನೋಡರನ್ನ ದೇಹದ ಒಳಗಿನ ಗುಡಿಯ ನೋಡರನ್ನ ಗುಡಿಯ ನೋಡರೆದು ಪಡವಿಗೆ ಒಡಿಯನ್ನ ಗುಡಿಯ ನೋಡರನ್ನ
What you've just heard in many different styles, some contemporary, some folk, are poems by the 19th century saint from North Karnataka, Sant Shishunal Sharif, who has been described as a Muslim Veerashaiva yogi. Shishunal Sharif is one among many fascinating characters that one meets in the North Karnataka Bhakti traditions. Look up his songs and his life online. I'm sure you'll have fun. I want to use this as a jumping off point to really talk about poets and about a tradition that started 800 years before Shishunal Sharif's time, in the 12th century. This is the Sharana tradition of Shiv Bhaktas in Karnataka, later known as Veerashaivism or Lingayatism. So in this third episode of Bhakti Republic, after having started our journey in Bombay, the progressives, Urdu poets and so on, having gone to Banaras, talked about Kabir, talked about Raidas, now we are back in this third episode to our home state, Karnataka. And because we are here, we are in Bangalore, we have access to wonderful musicians who sing Kannada songs. We have, for the first time on Radio Azim Premji University, music, songs that have been recorded for the show. So we have the amazing MD Pallavi, whose voice you will hear singing the Vachana poems. We have the wonderful guitarist Bruce Lee Money accompanying her on guitar. I think there's a good chance that the poems that you will hear sung on this episode have not been sung before. You might not have heard them. Even those who are familiar with this music might not have heard these poems. So come with me on this journey.
Bhakti Republic with Amit Basole. Episode 3 Kayakave Kailasa.
ಸ್ಥೂಲ ಸೂಕ್ಷ್ಮ ಕಾರಣವೆಂಬ ಮೂರು ಕಂಬವ ನೆಟ್ಟು ಆಗು ಚೇಗೆ ಎಂಬ ದಡಿಗೋಲಿನಲ್ಲಿ ಅಗಡದ ಎಮ್ಮೆಯ ಚರ್ಮವ ತೆಗೆದು ಉಭಯ ನಾಮವನೆಂಬ ನಾರಿನಲ್ಲಿ ತಿತ್ತಿಯ ನೊಪ್ಪವ ಮಾಡಿ ಭಾವವೆಂಬ.
What you just heard is a Kannada poem by a 12th century poet, Madara Chennaiya. It is a vachana. The word vachana in many Indian languages simply means speech or the spoken word. In Kannada, vachanas are a particular kind of poetry that we are going to look at a lot of examples today. This poem is a remarkable one. I really find it fascinating. First, let us hear the English translation done by Professor H.S. Shivprakash, and then we will talk about the poem. After erecting 3 pillars, the gross, the subtle, and the causal bodies, after beating the buffalo's rough hide, after removing the flesh with the staff of the manifest and the hidden, after tanning the hide with the fire of dualism, after pouring the caustic juice of quintessence into the hide pouch of awareness, the blemishes of soul thus destroyed, I, have come to take the sandals to his feet. Take care not of the ground below, but of the path your feet and sandals take. Do not be enslaved by the hand-awl, blade or peg, but realize, Rama Rama, your own true self, the joy of joys. Madara Chennaiya, the author of this poem, was a cobbler by trade who lived in the city of Kalyana in the 12th century in Karnataka. For me, it's an astounding poem. When I first read it, I had to read it again and again to see what all was going on in it. The flights of fancy, the metaphors that Chennaiya has packed in, the poem, I think, has the capacity to really fire up people, make them feel anger, maybe passion, even joy and liberation, because it's talking about, as you'll see soon, very sublime philosophical ideas, but through very raw, earthly metaphors. So let's look at this poem in some detail, and then through this poem, let's look at the tradition of the Sharana Shiv Bhaktas. So, for example, you look at the first line. Sthula Sukshma Karana Vimba Muru Kambava Nettu. Here the reference straight away is to a doctrine of the three bodies in Hinduism, where the human being is said to compose of three shariras, the causal body, the sukshma, the subtle or mental body, and the sthula, the gross or the material body. But the metaphor given is of pillars on which the platform for beating of animal hides, for example, will rest. By the time the poem is done, this human body has been compared to the cobbler's output, as it were, sandals. As in, I have come to take sandals to his feet. Just as for Kabir, the body was a product of a weaver's labor, the chadar or the chadariya, the fabric. Here it is sandals. And the processes of hiding and tanning that are used to describe the journey from two-ness to oneness, these are cobbler's processes. Right? This is what you do in your occupation. And in doing so, Chennaiya achieves this very deliberate, I think, juxtaposition of things like yemmeya charamava, the buffalo skin, right? With terms like ubhayanama, dualism, which is a kind of high theological term. And this contrast is what he's really going for. Now, I don't think this is a coincidence that the acts of labor and the objects that are mentioned in the poem are considered highly polluting and degrading in orthodox belief, right? So, rather, could possibly there be a very considered attempt to place these words next to each other that are not, quote-unquote, supposed to belong together. Labor, in particular manual labor of the artisanal castes, plays a central role in this spiritual tradition. And indeed, there is a often repeated mantra almost, which is also the title of our episode. Kayakave Kailasa is sort of the motto of this movement, and it asserts that labor is nothing less than the means to liberation, to emancipation. And we'll keep returning to this theme. Professor Shiv Prakash, who is a renowned poet himself and a scholar of Vachana literature and a translator whose work I am drawing extensively on, estimates that out of about 240 odd poets that we have record for in this tradition, perhaps as many as half might have been from laboring or artisanal classes. And I'll just give you a very illustrative list here. You can look up his work for many more people. So we've already heard of Madara Chennaiya, who was a cobbler. There is Revana Siddha, who was a shepherd. There is Devara Dasimaya, weaver. Molige Maraiya, the woodcutter. Madiwala Machideva, the washerman. A cowherd, a rice gatherer, a basket maker, a rope maker, barbers, farmers, a town crier, a hunter, sex workers, maids, and even Maritande, the burglar, who also happens to be a poet and a Shiv Bhakta. But the most well-known Vachana poet, often considered the leader of the movement also, is not from the laboring castes. He's a Brahmin, Basavanna. It is worth noting that the importance of thinkers from lower castes is clear from poems written by Basavanna himself, who says,
ಅಪ್ಪನೂ ನಮ್ಮ ಮಾದಾರ ಚೆನ್ನಯ್ಯ ಬೊಪ್ಪನೂ ನಮ್ಮ ಡೋಹರ ಕಕ್ಕಯ್ಯ ಚಿಕ್ಕಯ್ಯನಮ್ಮಯ್ಯ.
Our Madara Chennaya is my father. Our Dohara Kakkaya is my elder uncle. Look you, Chikkaya is my grandfather. Our Kinnara Bommaya is my elder brother. Then how come you do not know me, O Kudal Sangamadeva? All the Sharanas that are named in this poem are from the so-called untouchable castes. And as you can see, Basavanna is explicitly acknowledging his ancestors, his intellectual ancestors, through this mechanism. Further, a significant number of Sharanas are also women, often again from the artisan and farmer castes. Other than the most famous Akka Mahadevi, who many of you again would have heard of, poems from around 33 women Sharanas are available to us. Although the tradition recognizes many of them as wives of the male Sharana poets, such as the wives of Basavanna, or the wife of Devaradasimaya the weaver, whose name is Duggale, or Lakkama, who is the wife of Aidakki Maraya, and so on. We know their names. They are known as wives of the Sharana poets, but there is enough evidence to show that they were also poets and thinkers in their own right. And there are many stories that cast the woman in the husband-wife pair as the greater bhakta, to whom the male poet turns for guidance. What fascinates me as a newcomer, as an outsider to this tradition, this language, is what kind of a time and place is this, or was this, that gave rise to this phenomenon of such a large number of poets in a space of, say, 100 years or less. When I say the word Chalukya or Rashtrakuta, what comes to your mind? Do you think of sleepy school day afternoons when you struggle to stay awake in history class after lunch? Or maybe trying to mug up names of kings and their dates for a social studies exam? If so, let me recommend a recent book, Lords of the Deccan by Anirudh Kanisetti, a very engagingly written history of southern India, covering around 500 years or so, from the 7th century to the 12th century. I'll draw upon this book to set the stage for our story today. The time is 1150 CE, 1150 AD. And the place is the city of Kalyana or Kalyani, the capital of the Chalukya kings. What is this time and what is this place? In its heyday, Kalyana was a big city, a capital city, full of artisanal communities, trade, all the kinds of things that you think of when you think of old big cities, right? Think of Vijayanagar, for example, or Hampi, with its bazaars and artisanal communities and so on. The time is a very interesting one. It sometimes gets lost in history because many of us know something about ancient India. We know something about the Mughals. This is right in the middle. It's about 50 years before the Delhi Sultanate was set up, for example. If you've ever seen the film Ponniyin Selvan about the Chola kings, the time we are talking about is just after the Ponniyin Selvan period. And for those of you who are fans of European history, this is the time of Robin Hood in England. Walter Scott's famous novel Ivanhoe, set at the same time. Rumi, a famous Sufi poet that many of you would have heard of, shortly after this time. This is the period we are talking about. The site of Kalyana continues to be important in the ensuing centuries after our time. New dynasties emerge in this period after the Chalukyas. People like the Hoysalas or the Yadavas or the Kakatiyas, many of you would have heard of these dynasties from different parts of southern India. Sitting right in the middle of the Chalukya kings and these new dynasties, we have a very short-lived dynasty called the Kalachuris. And a particular Kalachuri king, Bijjala, whose minister is Basavanna, forms a critical part of our story. And we get a very peculiar historical moment here of about 50 or 100 years when we see political instability together with this fabulous religious, spiritual, social movement. The temple and other rituals feature prominently in this poetry as targets of attack. And it is worth noting in this context that this is the time when temples as institutions are emerging. They are powerful symbols of religious and political power and hence are being attacked. Think, for example, of the Brihadeshwara temple dedicated to Shiva in Tanjavur, commissioned by the Chola kings, and many more such temples. The great Kannada scholar, activist, and public intellectual D.R. Nagaraj mentions in one place that Basavanna rejects this very notion of the temple, which has become an instrument of power in his time, and he sees the human body as a temple.
ಉಳ್ಳವರು ಶಿವಾಲಯವ ಮಾಡುವರು ಉಳ್ಳವರು ಶಿವಾಲಯವ ಮಾಡುವರು ನಾನೇನ ಮಾಡಲಯ್ಯ ಬಡವನಯ್ಯ ನಾನೇನ ಮಾಡಲಯ್ಯ ಬಡವನಯ್ಯ.
The rich will make temples for Shiva. What shall I, a poor man, do? My legs are pillars, the body the shrine, the head a cupola of gold.
ಎನ್ನ ಕಾಲೇ ಕಂಬ ದೇಹವೇ ದೇಗುಲ ಎನ್ನ ಕಾಲೇ ಕಂಬ ದೇಹವೇ ದೇಗುಲ ಶಿರವೇ ಹೊನ್ನ ಕಳಶವಯ್ಯ ಶಿರವೇ ಹೊನ್ನ ಕಳಶವಯ್ಯ ಕೂಡಲ ಸಂಗಮ ದೇವಾ.
Listen, O Kudala Sangamadeva. Things standing shall fall, but the moving ever shall stay.
ಜಂಗಮ ಕಳಿವಿಲ್ಲ ಸ್ಥಾವರ ಕಳಿವುಂಟು ಜಂಗಮ ಕಳಿವಿಲ್ಲ ಉಳ್ಳವರು ಶಿವಾಲಯವ ಮಾಡುವರು.
All the poems that we have produced just for this show are available in the full soundtrack in the accompanying materials along with translations. You may have noticed in this and the earlier poem of Basavanna that we played that he addresses his lord by the name Kudala Sangama Deva, lord of the Sangama or river confluence of Kudala. This is an actual place about 15 kilometers from the Almaty Dam in Bagalkot district of Karnataka, where the Krishna and the Malaprabha rivers meet and they flow east towards Sri Shailam in Andhra Pradesh, which is another famous spiritually important site in this tradition. The second thing to note are the lines, things standing shall fall, but the moving ever shall stay, as beautifully translated by A.K. Ramanujan. If you remember Shailendra in our first episode, who says, Chalna Jeevan ki kahani, rukna maut ki nishani. Very similar idea. This is an important element in Sharana philosophy, the contrast between the sthavara and the jangama, between the standing, the static, here the temple, and the living, breathing, moving human. Without this latter, the former is only lifeless stone. It gets ossified, it gets fossilized, and so forth. And there's a further nice contrast, of course, in the translation between the moving staying while that which stays still disappears. Right? I really like this kind of play of words. This emphasis on the moving, the flowing, the flexible, as opposed to the standing, the fixed, or the unchanging, is seen in many different traditions we have. For example, Tukaram has a famous abhanga called Lahanpan Dega Deva. Which means, oh Lord, please make me small, give me smallness, which has been sung beautifully by Kumar Gandharva, where he says, a great flood washes away the trees, but the grass survives. The great flood washes away trees, but the grass survives. The larger the ego, the greater the pain. Somewhat reminiscent of that kind of rigidity versus flexibility idea. For Basavanna, the body is the temple. Kayakave Kailasa, he says. The Kaya in Sanskrit being the body in Kannada. Kayakave Kailasa, which is a little different from the title of our episode, Kayakave Kailasa. And I'm going to talk a little bit later about this contrast between the Kaya or the body and the Kayaka, which is labor done with the body or manual labor. But the body is also an instrument that sings the praises of the beloved one.
ಎನ್ನ ಕಾಯವದಂಡಿಗೆಯ ಮಾಡಯ್ಯ ಎನ್ನ ಕಾಯವದಂಡಿಗೆಯ ಮಾಡಯ್ಯ ಎನ್ನ ಶಿರವಾಸೋರೆಯ ಮಾಡಯ್ಯ ಎನ್ನ ಶಿರವಾಸೋರೆಯ ಮಾಡಯ್ಯ ಎನ್ನ ನರವಾ ತಂತಿಯ ಮಾಡಯ್ಯ ಎನ್ನ ನರವಾ ತಂತಿಯ ಮಾಡಯ್ಯ.
Make of my body the beam of a lute, of my head the sounding gourd, of my nerves the strings, of my fingers the plucking rods. Clutch me close and play your 32 ragas, O Kudala Sangamadeva. This theme echoes almost exactly in a poem attributed to Amir Khusro, who lived incidentally just a few 100 years or so after our period, and it's sung in Qawwalis to this day. Tan Rabab, Khusro says. Rabab is like a lute, which we just heard about from the Basavanna poem. My body is like this musical instrument, and all my nerves have become strings. Rage bhai saptar. So you can see it's almost in places a word for word sentiment that you find. This poem by Khusro, of course, I've heard many times, and I saw the Basavanna poem, and again it invoked a lot of joy in me to read it. But that joy got doubled or tripled when recently I encountered the same poem by Basavanna at the end of the autobiography of one of my favorite Hindustani classical singers, Mallikarjun Mansoor, who has himself sung many vachanas in beautiful style. He ends his autobiography, Nanna Rasayatre, it is called in Kannada, with this very poem, when he talks about his relationship to music and what music really means to him. The theme that we have started talking about with Basavanna's poem on the temples and how the rich build temples and how his body is a temple, that theme weaves itself through this tradition in so many different beautiful ways. Let's take just one more example here before we move on, and this is by Dasi Maya, the weaver, who comes at the same thing in this way.
ಅಚ್ಚ ಶಿವೈಕ್ಯಂಗೆ ಹೊತ್ತರೆ ಅಮಾವಾಸ್ಯೆ ಅಚ್ಚ ಶಿವೈಕ್ಯಂಗೆ ಹೊತ್ತರೆ ಅಮಾವಾಸ್ಯೆ ಮಟ್ಟ ಮಧ್ಯಾಹ್ನ ಸಂಕ್ರಾಂತಿ ಮಟ್ಟ ಮಧ್ಯಾಹ್ನ.
To the utterly at one with Shiva, there is no dawn, no new moon, no noonday, nor equinoxes, nor sunsets, nor full moons.
ಭಕ್ತನ ಮನೆಯ ಅಂಗಳವೇ ವಾರಾಣಸಿ ವಾರಾಣಸಿ.
His front yard is the true Varanasi, O Ramanatha. Even if you may not understand the language fully, I'm sure Many of you caught the key words in this poem, right? He's talking about Amavasya, he's talking about Sankranti, he's talking about Purnima. These are all the auspicious, inauspicious, various kinds of ritualistic times of day, times of the year that are being nullified, that are being negated by Dasimaya, who is saying, if you are at one with Shiva, then what is Purnima to you? What is Amavasya? What is Sankranti? It is all the same. And what I find very nice about this poem is that it ends with the mention of Varanasi, where we were last time talking about Kabir the weaver. And here is Dasimaya the weaver invoking Varanasi, of course, centuries before Kabir, which also gestures to the importance that Varanasi, the city, has in this system of thought that is being challenged and interrogated by the Sharanas. What makes the Sharana movement even more interesting is that they are not just talking, they are also acting. Remember, the context is emergence of new power hierarchies, religious orthodoxy being strengthened, temple construction, and all of these things, right? And this Bhakti movement, in part, can be interpreted as a reaction to these new hierarchies. And they challenge the caste and gender hierarchies very directly. And they create institutions to do so as well. There's something called the Anubhav Mantapa, which is the hall of experience, in which as equals peoples from different castes and men and women come to talk about their experiences of Shiva, of accessibility to Shiva, regardless of your background, and so on. The act that seems to have triggered a crisis is the celebration by the Sharanas of a marriage between an untouchable boy and a Brahmin girl, which released the wrath of the conservative elements as it's recorded. This is a very much recorded, you'll find this story in many, many different accounts of the Sharana movement. Passions run high, and the king Bijala himself has to yield to the orthodox elements who are up in arms about this marriage. And a period of conflict follows. In some accounts, it's a violent insurrection that follows, and the Sharanas have to leave Kalyana. And Bijala himself dies in this conflict. And Kettitu Kalyana is wrecked or Kalyana is destroyed, becomes a very commonly used phrase in Kannada literature thereafter and in folk narratives and so on. It refers to this historical moment. It's only centuries later, during the Vijayanagara period, that the Veershaiva religion and culture are revived and Vachana literature receives a new kind of impetus. And scholars begin to collect, collate, edit vachanas under the patronage of the Vijayanagara kings. And it's during this time that the anthology, the most well-known anthology of Sharana literature that exists, the Shunya Sampadane, or the Gathering of Emptiness, was compiled. This Kalyana episode has attracted the attention of many writers over the generations, and in recent times you will find prominent Kannada writers such as Lankesh, Girish Karnad, Shiv Prakash, who have all written plays on it as well. I want to talk about the vachanas of two people in particular who are, along with Basavanna, possibly the most famous proponents of this tradition, Allama Prabhu and Akka Mahadevi. Allama Prabhu has a special status in the tradition. The Shunya Sampadane is in some ways a kind of, he's the anchor there, he's the hero of that story. And the anthology of verses is collected in such a way that it's a series of debates and propositions made by Allama Prabhu and his agreements or disagreements with other poets. That's how that document is structured. And he's referred to by many interesting names in this document. He's called the Shunya Murti. The Shunya Murti. Shunya is a very important concept here. It's a Buddhist concept also. You can call it nothingness, you can call it emptiness, you can call it void. There are all of these synonyms for it. So Shunya Murti is basically a void that has taken on form, a void in person. That's one of the names given to Allama Prabhu. Sometimes he's also called the void of the void, which if some of you are scratching your head at this really weird phrase, you might remember, if you've seen the show on Ghalib, you'll remember this phrase, ghaib-e-ghaib, that Ghalib had, which he called the manifest world, the hiding of the hiding, or the hiding of the hidden. It's very similar to this void of void kind of idea. In the vachanas of Allama Prabhu, you will find these kind of Sufi and Vedantic themes a lot, which we also encountered in our Ghalib show, and we'll encounter many more before we are done with this show as well. So here's an example of Allama Prabhu in a very Vedantic type of mode. I think you will find, at least I am reminded of that. So let's hear this vachana.
ಆದಿಯಾಧಾರವಿಲ್ಲದಂದು ಹಮ್ಮುಬಿಮ್ಮುಗಳಿಲ್ಲದಂದು
When neither source nor substance was, when neither I nor mine, when neither form nor formless was, when neither void was nor non-void, nor that which moves or moves not. You see the series of negations, that something that goes beyond each of these dualities, because that is what they are, and these are the seekers of oneness. So in their search for the shunya, or for that which is beyond all dualities, these thinkers pass through these many stages and leave behind that which is not useful in the quest. And needless to say, a lot of what is left behind are the symbols and rituals that are no longer needed for somebody who has understood the nature of reality. So, for example, Allama Prabhu says in one of his vachanas, what you call the Veda is a work to be read. What you call a Shastra is market news. What you call Purana is bully's boast. What you call logic is butting of rams. What you call Bhakti is only a show for profit of a meal. What you call Guheshwara is the absolute beyond bounds. Guheshwara is Allama Prabhu's Ankita, or the name that he uses to address Shiva. So he's passing through the Vedas, Shastras, Puranas and so on, and even Bhakti, and going to this place which is the ultimate destination. I think these few examples, hopefully, from Allama Prabhu may also serve to illustrate an important point about this tradition that K. Ishwaran makes in his book on the Vachanas, that you see a very interesting synthesis of the Margi, or the classical or the great tradition, and the Desi, the folk or the little tradition. So both the Margi and the Desi are coming together in an interesting way and maintaining their own distinctiveness. For me, an illustration of this fusion of the Desi and Margi is the specific form that each poet's Ankita or mark takes. Right? I mentioned earlier that for Basavanna, the poems always end in Kudala Sangamadeva. For Allama Prabhu, they always end in Guheshwara. For Akka Mahadevi, you will find they end in Channa Mallikarjuna. And each poet has their own specific name, which is very local, very contextual. And for Basava, it is actually a place from where he comes. But it's also referring to Shiva and connecting to a grand Hindu tradition through Vedanta and through monism. It is also not very easy to classify the thinking in other binaries like Hindu or non-Hindu, for example. The status is ambiguous because there's constant dialogue with Hindu scriptures, while also departing significantly from the scriptures. So it is really nothing less than an attempt to create a monotheist or a monist community of equals, because that's the other very important part that we're going to come to shortly, the revolt against the hierarchy, right? A community of equals with theology that is very closely linked to Hindu theology. And in that sense, it is similar to the Vaishnav monotheism that you'll find in the north, of which Kabir can be considered to be a part.
Coming up on the other side of the break.
Burgling or robbery. So let's hear from Maritande, the burglar.
ಕತ್ತಲೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ಕನ್ನವನಿಕ್ಕಿದಡೆ
गीत गाता हूँ
Rich Kishore Malhotra ran away from home in Bihar in his teens, enamored by the portrayal of truckers in movies and TV serials. He thought it was the best job in the world. Life on the road, however, was anything but what he had imagined.
The difficulties about food, about water, about toilets, these are the basic needs.
Constantly being on the move, crisscrossing state boundaries, and driving 14 to 16 hours a day, truck drivers rarely have the option to get a toothache attended to or check a failing eyesight.
कोई प्रॉब्लम दिखाकर छोड़ते नहीं हैं, किसके पास जाना, कैसे जाना, क्या करना है, तो वो चीज़ भी हम लोगों को गाइड करते हैं, उनको छोड़ते नहीं हैं.
And in this episode, we take you to parking lots in and around Kolkata.
Stories of Change with Anuradha Nagraj, only on Radio Azim Premji University.
Alongside Basavanna and Allama Prabhu, the third most famous Sharana is Akka Mahadevi, whose life story, if you look it up, will remind you a lot of many other famous women Bhakti poets, like Meera, for instance, in that it is a story of revolt against orthodoxy, against the norms that bind women, and so on. So Akka Mahadevi's poems talk about this, these gender norms and her revolt against these gender norms by connecting to the bigger Sharana concerns. And let's look at one example in which I think you will find many resonances with the poetry of Mirabai as well.
ಸಾವಿಲ್ಲದ ಕೇಡಿಲ್ಲದ ರೂಹಿಲ್ಲದ ಚಲುವಂಗೆ ನಾನೊಲಿದೆ.
To him, with no death, no decay, no form, to the beautiful one, I have given myself, O Mother. To him, with no place, no end, no space, no signs, to the beautiful one, I have given myself, O Mother. To him, with no clan, no country, to the peerless, handsome one, I have given myself, O Mother. For this reason, Channa Mallikarjuna, the handsome one, is the man for me. These wasting, dying men, take them away, throw them into the oven. We started this episode with a striking example of the centrality of manual labor, Kayaka in Kannada, in Sharana poetry. Shiv Prakash, in his book of translations of the Vachana poems, notes that, and I'm quoting, the Sharana movement had raised the morale of the artisan castes. They had become not just literate, but literary figures. Cobblers, town criers, street performers, prostitutes, washermen, potters, all of them, new converts to the Sharana movement, had become spiritually awakened, politically conscious, and socially aware. As we find later on in the poetry of the Varkari saints of Maharashtra, as well as in Kabir and Ravidas, occupational metaphors are very common in all of this poetry. But in the Vachana corpus, I find that it goes, or at least I feel, it goes to even another level. And we saw an example of this in Chennaya's poem. Let's look at two more examples of these. I'm going to start with a very unusual occupation indeed, burgling or robbery. So let's hear from Maritande, the burglar, who says,
ಕತ್ತಲೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ಕನ್ನವನಿಕ್ಕಿದಡೆ ಎನಗೆ ಕತ್ತಿಯ ಕೊಟ್ಟ ಕರ್ತುವಿಗೆ ಭಂಗ.
If I'm a thief at night, that would be a shame to the master who gave me the picklock. If I enter houses when people are forgetful, that would be a shame to my expertise.
ಅವರು ಮರೆದಿರ್ತಲ್ಲಿ ಮನೆಯ ಹೊಕ್ಕೊಡೆ ಎನ್ನ ಚೋರತನದ ಅರಿಕೆಗೆ ಭಂಗ. ಮರೆದಿರ್ತವರ ಎಬ್ಬಿಸಿ ಅವರಿಗೆ ಅವರೊಡವೆಯ ತೋರಿ.
I wake up the forgetful, show them their riches, then bring out my own riches, O Father, Lord of Mara, the love God, foe of Mara. As you have probably figured out, the metaphor here of the picklock and the kind of occupation of burgling houses, that is what Maritande is using to talk about waking people up, communicating a certain idea that shows them who they really are. And he does that in a delightful way by saying, well, I'm no ordinary thief. I don't go in the night when people are sleeping and it's very easy to rob them. But the philosophy of Kayaka, which Shiv Prakash calls also the path of labor as a means of emancipation and liberation, that goes beyond just the use of occupational metaphors. And a poem that strikingly demonstrates how central the category of labor is for these people is this poem from Ayadaki Maraya, the rice gatherer, who says,
ಕಾಯಕದಲ್ಲಿ ನಿರತನಾದಡೆ ಕಾಯಕದಲ್ಲಿ ನಿರತನಾದಡೆ ಗುರುದರ್ಶನವಾದಡು ಮರೆಯಬೇಕು 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 ಮರೆಯಬೇಕು.
One who is engaged in work must even forget the Guru's sight.
ಲಿಂಗ ಪೂಜೆಯಾದಡು ಮರೆಯಬೇಕು 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 ಮರೆಯಬೇಕು.
Linga worship he must forget. Even if the Jangama stands in front, the obligation must be snapped.
ಜಂಗಮ ಮುಂದೆ ನಿಂದಿತ್ತಡು ಹಂಗು ಹರಿಯಬೇಕು. ಕಾಯಕವೇ ಕೈಲಾಸವಾದ ಕಾರಣ
Since such work is as good as heaven, Amareshwara Linga himself must do it.
ಕಾಯಕದೊಳಗು
You probably caught the phrase Kayakave Kailasa right there, which is also the title of today's show, and in the translation was portrayed as such work is as good as heaven, but you can also translate it as work is worship, as I said earlier, or if none of these work for you, then just note the juxtaposition of these two important words, Kayaka, manual labor, and Kailasa, with all its significance in Hindu thought. Note the last two lines. because Kayakave Kailasa, Amareshwara Linga himself does it too, must do it too. So it is a complete equating of the divine principle with the manual labor principle. So Dasimaya, who is a weaver, when he is weaving a piece of cloth, he becomes Shiva himself. So in one of his poems, he says, "Who weaves the sari? You or me, O Ramnatha?" Shiva Prakash calls it not surrender to the divine so much as transformation of the self into the divine through the act of labor. In the interview that we did with him, he elaborates on the significance of Kayaka.
To the best of my knowledge, only vachanakaras from the artisan class, they developed a consistent philosophy of Kayaka. To use a term from comparative religion, the soteriology of labor. Labor as a means of liberation. Culture of the head, culture of the heart, and culture of the hand. So this culture of the hand developed only in the context of Kannada Vachana tradition.
All of this raises a difficult question. Should we see these thoughts as radical and subversive, or as conforming to caste-based occupational duties? After all, if one's caste-based occupation is the means to liberation, this could be interpreted to mean that one should do that and nothing else. Perhaps it is a bit anachronistic. I don't know. I don't know what you think. But to think from the point of view of leaving traditional occupations as we do today, when we think of challenging caste, it's a little maybe not quite fitting to that context of the time. But of course, opinions may differ on this. What I do appreciate, though, and perhaps you can also appreciate, is the vigor with which these thinkers were attacking the symbols of caste pride, orthodoxy, rituals, hypocrisy. They were really squarely hitting that. And I'll give you two hard-hitting examples of this kind of attack from two women poets. One who is one of the earliest Dalit so-called untouchable caste women poets in Kannada, Kailasa, and one from Sule Sankava, who was a prostitute or a sex worker. So let's look at those poems and then we'll come back to seeing what we can make of them.
ಕುರಿಕೋಳಿ ಕರಿಮೀನು ತಿಂಬವರಿಗೆಲ್ಲ ಕುರಿಕೋಳಿ ಕರಿಮೀನು ತಿಂಬವರಿಗೆಲ್ಲ ಕುಲಜರೆಂದೆಂಬರು
They say all those are high-born who eat sheep, fowl, and tiny fish. They say all those are low-born who eat the cow that reigns on Shiva, sacred milk sanctified 5 times.
ಅವರೆಂತು ಕೀಳು ಜಾತಿಯಾದರು
What the Brahmins had eaten adorned the grass, and a dog licked it up and went away. What the cobblers had eaten adorned the grass. Now the Brahmins' ornament, in other words, bags, are made of cow's hide, for ghee and for water.
ಶೋಭಿತವಾಗಿ ನಾಯಿ ನೆಕ್ಕಿ ಹೋಯಿತು
Senseless Brahmins who drink ghee and water from such leather bags, thinking it's sacred, they can't escape utmost perdition. The master of Urulinga Peddi doesn't approve of such men. She's setting up a contrast, as you can see, between those who are highborn or so-called, they say, she says, right? So they're so-called highborn people who have these dietary preferences, and others who are so-called lowborn who have other dietary preferences. And then she goes on to show the arbitrariness of why certain preferences are mapped on to certain types of status. And she goes on to show that this leather, these low-born people are eating the cow and are considered low-born because they eat the cow. But then there's also the cow that gives the leather, and that leather forms the bags that carry the ghee that is sacred. So along the way somewhere something weird has happened, she's pointing out.
ಒತ್ತೆಯ ಹಿಡಿದು ಒತ್ತೆಯ ಹಿಡಿದು ಮತ್ತೊತ್ತೆಯ ಹಿಡಿಯೇ ಹಿಡಿದಡೆ ಬೆತ್ತಲೆ ನಿಲ್ಲಿಸಿ ಕೊಲ್ಲುವರಯ್ಯ.
In my harlot's trade, having taken one man's money, I daren't accept a second man's, sir. And if I do, they'll stand me naked and kill me, sir. And if I cohabit with the polluted, my hands, nose, ears, they will cut off with a red-hot knife, sir. Ah, never, no. Knowing you, I will not. My word on it, O Nirlajeshwara. I think I don't need to tell you how much anger, pathos, but also sarcasm comes out of this really powerful poem. Remember, this was written by somebody who was on the margins of society nearly 1,000 years ago. So it's a voice speaking to us over all of those centuries, and it's a very powerful voice. First, note her name for Shiva. Very different from what we have seen so far. She calls him Nirlajeshwara. Lajja, shame, Nirlajja, the shameless. The God of the shameless. The shameless God, or the God of the shameless. The Lord of the shameless ones. And you can see how that resonates with her occupation as well. The poem itself, here's my reading of it in brief. You can see if that makes sense to you. I read it as a very caustic, sarcastic take on society of the time and how they treat people like her. But she's using those really dramatic examples of punishment and so on to demonstrate her loyalty to Shiva. That's what the poem is about. As she ends it, she's giving him her word that she's not going to be disloyal to him. Why? Because in her trade, having taken one man's money, there's no question of accepting another one's, because these are the punishments that await if one is disloyal. So I found it really very difficult, I mean, I don't know how to describe it, but it's a very interesting way of saying something that so many poets also say, that I'm yours, I'm loyal to you, but she's using these kinds of instances from her own life to make that point. So we return to the question of what happened to this radical spirit that we find so obviously manifested in the poems that we have looked at today. The noted Kannada scholar D.R. Nagaraj, who I've referred to earlier, and whose works I highly recommend, perceptively warns in one of his essays that, and I quote him, the Vatapi Garbha of Hinduism allows only the occasional eruption of protest, only to be reabsorbed again in the quiescence of conservatism. The Vatapi Garbha, you assimilate things. When you keep assimilating, it allows something to emerge, but then it is eaten up, that is consumed. Shiv Prakash has argued that the Shunya Sampadane, the anthology of vachanas, is an attempt to write out or remove the vachanakaras from artisanal castes, both men and women. But I'm still left with the question, How do we really understand the failure then of such attempts to transform society? Or is that the wrong way to ask the question? We will return, I think we'll keep returning to these concerns as we go through these series. And maybe in the last episode, we can take stock of all of these kind of concerns. Here, I'll leave you with one very important observation that again Nagraj makes when he is talking about the contemporary or the modern anti-caste movements, the Dalit movements and the anti-caste movements. And he points out that the origins of these modern anti-caste movements lie in the convergence of two forces. There's a transcendental aspect of fighting caste ego, caste pride. It's a spiritual kind of a take. And then there is the mundane reality of fighting for real opportunities in education, in jobs, and so on. So it's in that first part of the struggle, which really is not unimportant, right? Nagraj is pointing out that both of these have a place. The struggle for real opportunities, material opportunities, but also the struggle in the transcendental, in the spiritual, in the philosophical realm. And it is there that this Bhakti Parampara, the Bhakti tradition, has a very large role to play. And in the next episode, when we look at the Marathi Warkari poets, we will talk more about their continuing contribution to the modern day anti-caste movements in that state. But for now, I'll leave you with an interesting song that I discovered on YouTube, which is a tribute to Madara Chennaiya, the poet that we started our show with, who lived 900 years ago. And here is a young person today giving him tribute.
ಸಾಹಿತ್ಯ ಮತ್ತು ಹಾಡಿದವರು ರವಿಕುಮಾರ್ ಕೆ ಮೇತ್ರಿ ಸಾಕಿನ್ ರನ್ನ ಬೆಳಗಲಿ. ಇವರ ಮೊಬೈಲ್ ನಂಬರ್ 9880114633. 12ನೇ ಶತಮಾನದಾಗ ಹುಟ್ಟೈತಿ ಹುಲಿಯ, ಶಿವನನ್ನೇ ಭೂಮಿಗೆ ತಂದ ಒಡೆಯ, ಇವರೇ ನಮ್ಮ ಮಾದರ ಚೆನ್ನಯ್ಯ, ಹುಟ್ಟೈತಿ ಮಾದಾರ ಹುಲಿಯ, ಇವರೇ ನಮ್ಮ ಮಾದಾರ ಚೆನ್ನಯ್ಯ.
I want to end by just talking a little bit about the continued presence of these ideas and these poems in society over the centuries coming down to our modern period. For example, there is a Telugu poet, Vemana, who lived in the later half of the 17th century, born around 1650s or so, who Rajmohan Gandhi, in his recent book on modern South Asia, describes as a poet of the people, a philosopher of freedom, a fighting saint, and whose aphorisms, whose poems have become aphorisms and are on the lips of ordinary Telugu-speaking folk. Vemana is also coming from the same Lingayat Veershaiva tradition that we have been looking at today, though he is writing in Telugu and not Kannada, which we have been looking at mostly. But despite that change in language, there is very much the same kind of spirit in his poetry. The spirit to question and challenge ritualism, symbolism, make fun of people who confuse the external things for the true internal self, and so forth. And I'll give you only one example of it. You can, I'm sure, look up more poems by him. In one of his poems in Telugu, I'm paraphrasing, he asks the following rhetorical questions. If a Muslim person were to go to Tirupati, would he then become Hindu? If a pig were to go to Kashi, would he become an elephant? If a dog were to bathe in the Godavari, would he become a lion? You see the drift that he's trying to get at. Now, after the main period that we've talked about today, which is the 12th century, from the 14th century onwards, with the establishment of the Bahmani Sultanate in Bidar, which is close to Kalyana, the great river of Hindu tradition meets another mighty river. There's a Sangam, if you will, of Islam, and in particular of the Sufi traditions in Islam. So these two are coming together to give rise to many fascinating, syncretic individuals who embody both these traditions, and of course wider bodies of thought and literature. For example, a few months ago when I was in Bidar, I visited the mausoleum of the Bahmani Sultan Ahmad Shah, who is known as Wali or the saint. The Dargah of Ahmad Shah Wali is the destination every year of Hindu pilgrims from surrounding areas who worship it as the shrine of Allama Prabhu. Now, if you like me are scratching your head about this because the times don't match and certainly the people are different, Ahmad Shah has nothing to do with Allama Prabhu historically, and so on, well, keep scratching your head, because this is the kinds of things that make us think about how society is choosing to remember various kinds of cultural and intellectual encounters. You can read more about this particular phenomenon, by the way, in a very nice article by the Bangalore-based journalist Vikar Ahmed Saeed, who has written about this and many other syncretic traditions of North Karnataka. A particularly interesting example of such a tradition came up in our interview with Professor Shiv Prakash, and I will let him tell you the story in brief of Fakireshwar Swami of Dharwad in North Karnataka.
For example, after the 15th, 16th century, Sufism came down to south, and some of our Swara vachanakaras, the Tattvapadakaras, like Krishna Sharif, so on, they were influenced by Sufism also. And some of these saints didn't write any poetry. For example, there's a shrine of Fakireshwar Swami. Fakireshwar Swami in Dharwad. So the title Fakir Ishwara. He was born in the Lingat community, but his mother didn't have a child for a long time. She sought the blessings of a Sufi and he was born. The Sufi said, when your son is born, you should surrender. She did. So he initiated him into Sufi practices. After some time, he said, you should go and get yourself initiated into your Shaivite practices. So in this place, Fakireshwara shrine, you have the symbols of both Islam and though the Swami is Lingayat.
Another example of the same tradition is the person that we started this show with, Sant Shishunal Sharif, who D.R. Nagraj describes as a Muslim Veerashaiva yogi with a Brahmin Advaitin guru. Sant Shishunal Sharif was born in the early 19th century. So you can see how we've come all the way from where we started in the 12th century down to now the 19th century, and we are still looking at the unfolding of this tradition. So Shishunal Sharif comes from a much more modern context. He was born in Haveri district in Karnataka, and even now you can go and visit his dargah in the town of Shishunal where he is from. And you will see again through his poems a fondness for all kinds of absurdities and sarcasm and, making you think through unexpected types of themes and motifs. Where the city of Kalyana once stood is today a town called Basavakalyana, named, as you know by now, for Basavanna. Next time, we travel 200 kilometers straight west from Basavakalyana when we end up at Pandharpur in Maharashtra, the seat of the Varkari poets. But for now, I want to end this discussion that we've had on the Vachanakaras with a super contemporary poem, a poem that was written last month by Bruce Lee Money, who has also played the guitar on our episode today. The poem is titled Skin in the Game. Like dough stretched by loving calloused hands, fired to bread, is truth pulled by dreaming deluded minds. He said, she said, these cattle I skin, then dry and beat, the meat we eat and fall from God. So the double drum can speak with high-born hands, caressing low the rhythm of the status quo.
you enjoy this show, then don't forget to like and share our channel. Follow us and subscribe to be updated when we release new shows and episodes. To know more about Radio Azim Premji University, visit our website by clicking on the link in the show notes.
You're listening to
आप सुन रहे हैं
You're listening to सुनो था
നിങ്ങൾ കേൾക്കുന്നത്
ನೀವು ಕೇಳ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದೀರಾ
रेडियो
Radio Azim Premji
यूनिवर्सिटी